Welcome to Early Adopter, the podcast where we help make AI your unfair advantage. I'm Jess, a marketing exec, chief jargon buster, and I help ground AI in your practical day-to-day.
And I'm Kyle. I live at the intersection of data, product, and strategy, and I do my best to turn the technical AI chaos into something you can actually use.
We go beyond the overhyped headlines and give you the unvarnished truth about AI, what's real, what's hype, and what actually matters for your business.
Every week, we simplify the complex, spotlight the risks, and give you practical tools to make smarter decisions as the landscape rapidly shifts around us.
From agents to commerce to prompt engineering and vibe coding, we deliver honest insights, actionable strategies, and zero gatekeeping.
Let's dive in.
This is Early Adopter. Welcome to Early Adopter, the podcast where we help make AI your unfair advantage. I'm Jess.
And I'm Kyle. And this week's going to be a little bit different. Rather than jumping into our weeks, we need to tell you something that probably feels a little un-early adopter of us right now. And we're actually going to take a break this week.
That is shocking. I know. We are going to be taking some time off for the holidays. We have been heads down on AI content since we launched this podcast in May without a break. And if you've been listening, you know the pace has been a lot, shall we say?
Almost an understatement. I think every single week is just a fire hose of information. Honestly, the holidays are the perfect time to really test some of the stuff we've been meaning to try out. I know you have some plans to test some tools.
Yep.
I have some AI tools I've bookmarked that I keep telling myself I would get to. I have a couple projects for some automations. So I think this is the moment for everyone to start playing around with a little bit of things while we're off.
But while we are out, we are not leaving you hanging. We are re-releasing some of our most popular episodes. These are the ones that people have requested. They're the ones that people have told us have actually changed how they work. So we want to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to listen to those ones.
And the data shows that they're the most popular. So we think these are the ones that you need to really cover in order to level up. So if you're new to the podcast, this is actually a great way to catch up. But if you've listened before, I think they're worth a re-listen, especially because some of these are really important for, how you're actually going to use AI and if you want to set yourself up for success in 2026. Perspective can change a lot of that. And with how rapidly everything moves, this is a great time.
So we will be back in early January with some fresh content and some fresh ideas. In the meantime, enjoy the re-releases, have a play around with some AI while we're away, and we will see you in January. In the meantime, just as a reminder, you can find us on Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn, YouTube, basically everywhere. We are at early_adopter. Remember, no E in adopter.
Yeah. And if you've got an AI story or a question you want us to tackle when you're back, send it our way at hello@earlyadopter.ai. Remember, no E in the adopter. And until then, happy holidays, everyone.
Yes, happy holidays.
Oh, got it.
Okay, so Kyle, I have to ask, when most people hear AI, they think ChatGPT or they think Claude, these massive models that are really like in the public mindset. But today we're going to talk about something completely different, aren't we?
Absolutely. We are talking about something a little different today. And so I want to think of it like this. If ChatGPT is like hiring a Harvard PhD who knows everything about anything, small language models, which is what we're going to be covering today, are like hiring a really brilliant specialist who knows your business inside and out. And for most small business tasks, that specialist is actually better and going to be way more affordable.
And the thing that I really love about small language models, and we'll get into what those are shortly, is that they're really accessible. And in fact, some of the tools that we'll be talking about today can be set up in 15 minutes with very little or no coding experience. But first, before we get into all of that, let's talk about what they actually are and why our listeners should care about them.
Let's start with a picture in your head. So imagine you've got a huge, heavy sledgehammer. Amazing if you're going to break down a wall, but probably the wrong thing if you're trying to hire and trying to hang a picture frame. That's the difference between a massive large language model and a small language model, or SLM. So SLMs are kind of the right size tool for very specific jobs. They're compact, efficient, and built for focused tasks.
I think that's a really great analogy because I immediately was able to envision that in my head. as someone who's hung many pictures in my
Yeah,
life.
I mean, look, and I love a sledgehammer and I love doing demo, but definitely not using a sledgehammer to hang a picture frame or screw in a TV.
No, definitely not. But I think one of the first questions that everyone's going to be asking is, when you say small in the small language model, are we talking about small as in less capable? Because I think that that's a really
Mhm.
important question.
Yeah, when we say small, we're talking about the number of parameters. And this is the internal learning weights, which can sound a little techie, but kind of to put this in reference, a large language model might have hundreds or billions of these parameters. That's like the amount of training data. Whereas a small language model might have a few billion. The key is that smaller doesn't mean worse. It just means focused and very highly tuned.
So, to put it into context that our listeners might understand, it's like the difference between a general practitioner, so someone who's got expertise in a lot of different things, and a heart surgeon. So, the heart surgeon might know less about treating a sprained ankle, but if you need heart surgery, you're going to want the specialist, not the generalist.
Exactly. And that focus brings massive advantages for small businesses. First up is cost. We're talking AI that can run on your laptop or even like a modest server. So, not some supercomputer in the cloud with massive storage implications.
But what can these smaller models actually do? Because I'm guessing that they're probably not going to write the next great American novel.
Right. Yeah, they're not writing War and Peace. But for most business tasks, they're brilliant. So think customer support chatbots that handle 90% of your frequently asked questions, content creation that's highly tuned to your writing style. So social posts, product descriptions, email newsletters. We've talked about how content generation can be really great. Small language models are actually really useful for that if you fine tune it on your writing samples. Another great example is data analysis. So if you want to summarize reports or extract key points from customer feedback, organize information, that can be really useful. I think that's really just the tip of the iceberg. Internal knowledge bases. So a new hire can ask an AI about your company policies instead of interrupting you. Another great example is task automation. So AI reading your emails, drafting quick replies. A lot of the examples that we've talked about in the past can be really utilized well using small language models if you do a little bit of fine tuning on your specific use case. You could even use it for multilingual support if you've got international customers.
Okay, before we go any deeper, I've been hearing open source and open weight thrown around with these models. So can you explain what the difference is to us? Because I think that's quite important to know.
Great question. And this sometimes can get a little bit into the developer world, but we'll kind of break this down really quickly just so you understand the difference. Because open source is a word that we hear a lot. So in this instance, open source means the model's architecture and training code are public. So you can inspect, change, or even retrain it. Whereas open weight means you can download and run the pre-trained model as is, but you don't necessarily get all the training data or code. So for most small businesses, or for if you're trying to put these into action now, open weight is going to be enough. And that's a really important difference and helpful in this instance. So you can still fine tune it for your needs or for your writing style without having to reinvent the wheel and run and have like access to a lot of processing power. So open source gives you a lot of flexibility if you want to deeply customize it, but that's probably, again, a little bit of overkill. You can probably just take one of these open weight models and utilize it.
So a little bit like going back to our sledgehammer versus a regular hammer analogy. I think that explains it nicely. But both of the options, open weight and open source, make small language models more accessible.
Yeah. And to kind of give you an example where I think this can get really fun. So I used a small open weight model from Meta called Olama. And I fine-tuned it on a bunch of company emails so it could analyze sentiment and break down details like seniority of the sender, the department that they were in, identify the urgency of the conversation and some recurring topics, and built kind of like an email analyzer. So, and I did this with a really clear prompt structure. So the output was exactly what I needed it for reporting. And the beauty of all of this is that I was actually able to run it locally and process tens of thousands of emails very quickly for my very specific task. I didn't have to send a single bit of this out to ChatGPT or have to use like all of the tokens that would have cost me using GPT-5 or something like that.
I think that's really clever, and it really, if you have any concerns about privacy, and I know we'll talk more about this, but I think that that ability to keep things local on your own computer or whatever the case may be is going to be very important and helpful for anyone who's looking to use these.
Yeah, there's a couple really important distinctions of why you would use this SLM in this example versus an LLM. Privacy is a great one. So you don't send any sensitive data to an external cloud provider. But cost is a really big one. And I think, as we're talking about how does a small business utilize the tools that used to only be available for enterprise, SLMs can really bridge that gap from a cost perspective. Analyzing thousands of emails using GPT-4 or GPT-5 would have been incredibly expensive. But this basically cost me nothing using the small language model because I downloaded it to my local computer, analyzed it, and ran it here locally. Also, from a speed perspective, the SLMs respond, in seconds, because there's less reasoning overhead required. And then again, using the fine tuning, I was able to really customize it for my niche use case. So it was very useful. So I think for about 80% of business automation, like the screwdriver or the SLM is a better fit than swinging the sledgehammer. And I think a quick pro tip, you can run a sample of your SLM's inputs and outputs through a large language model to spot errors or tricky edge cases it struggled with, and then use the LLM's explanation to refine and retrain your SLM, making it sharper over time without sacrificing some of the speed or efficiency. So you can do some pretty clever things here with SLMs.
And I think what I love the most about this is that SLMs are often perfect for the tasks that we talk about a lot, the ones that really eat up your time. But let's have a little bit of a chat about what the downsides are, because there's always a catch, right? Like these sound great on paper, but there's always a downside. So what is it in this instance?
Yeah, the main trade-off is complexity. So if you need deep multi-domain reasoning, or you need a lot of those features that you get off the shelf from ChatGPT and Claude, like web search, deep research is a great example. Or if you need to do like highly creative work that's drawing on a lot of different domains, think like writing a legal brief or inventing an entire ad campaign from scratch. A big model is going to win every time. So the key, as we talk about, is matching the tool to the job, matching when you need a sledgehammer and when you need a screwdriver. A great example is that you're not going to use a sledgehammer to fix a watch. So, that's the same thing for an SLM and an LLM.
So I also imagine that there's a bit of a quality question involved with this as well. So we want to make sure that we're, are we talking about AI that sounds really robotic or unnatural? So if we're talking smaller, is the tone affected by the smaller aspect?
Yeah, some small language models can be less polished out of the box. There's a lot less parameters. It's had a lot less training data. So it doesn't, as its pattern recognition tries to identify which words, it just doesn't have as much of a catalog to draw from. So it is smart to keep a human in the loop early on. But for most business communication, you want clarity and accuracy, not poetry, not War and Peace. So you can use the AI for the heavy lifting, and then you do the final pass. And again, great time to fine tune some of your early writing samples so you give it more of the training data that it needs to make it more relevant and more personalized.
And we always talk about having a human in the loop anyway to refine and to review things. And so I don't think like none of that changes. That strategy doesn't change. We would suggest that for an LLM as well. So this is just being consistent. And you should always have a human looking at what the content, what the output is.
I think it's getting really popular these days to talk about how AI is replacing or can do everything for you. I think we're pretty consistent in our messaging that AI assists what you're already doing. So again, going back to that ethos, start with an AI assisted workflow, not looking at AI replacement workflows. SLMs are great for assisting. Let the AI or the small language model handle the first draft, then you polish it. Let it analyze or categorize your emails with a really good, prompt. Go back to our prompt engineering examples, and then you can review the analysis and the categories and fine tune that and work on it. So it's all about augmenting your processes or your team, not replacing them.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with that. But I think here's what I really want to know, because this actually does sound more technical than we normally get into. And I know that that's one of our big things is that we want to make this sort of stuff accessible for anyone to be able to use. So like, how do they actually get started with this? Because this does sound very complicated as we're talking about it.
And look, my example that I gave is a little technical, right? I downloaded the open source model. I ran it locally. I'm using code to do all that. And I can see how that would put people off. But I think where it gets really exciting, there are a lot of no code tools that are perfect this sort of thing that are popping up. There are tools now where you can literally drag and drop your FAQ document and boom, you have a working chatbot on a small language model that doesn't require any programming and you can connect to it or put it on your website.
That sounds great and a little more accessible than I think what you, the example.
Yeah.
But then you are more technical. So, but let's now look at a more concrete example. So let's say that I run a small e-commerce business that sells handmade soaps. Like, how could I use an SLM for that particular use case?
It's a perfect example. And let's talk about one of those no-code tools. So a great tool that you could use is something called Chatbase. I think we'll put in the show notes a link to their website. You upload your FAQ document or just paste in your product information, and you can customize the chatbot's name. You can define its tone, how you want it to respond. Call it Soap Helper Sarah or something like that, right? Anything to make it a little bit more conversational, human. Set the tone to friendly but informative. Then you can copy literally one line of code and paste it into your website. And this will take all of maybe 30 minutes. This is no different than taking like a little bit of code from like your HubSpot and putting it in your website, or your Google Analytics code and putting it on your website and injects it to all the pages. So this, I think, is definitely within the realm of no code.
And I think any tool that you use will have steps to walk you through that process. So it's not like you're doing it completely blind. And as you say, if you've ever put Google Analytics code onto your website, the steps, or you just send it off to your developer, whatever the case may be. So don't be put off by that one line of code element to it.
Also, quick pro tip, ask ChatGPT how to do it.
Yeah.
It's actually really good at like showing you instructions and then helping you debug if you need to insert, code into your website.
Perfect. So then what does the output look like? Like, what then happens when a customer would visit my e-commerce soap site?
Yeah, you've probably seen this, in the real world quite a bit. You see a little chat bubble at the bottom right. So when you click on that, you can ask it, do you have unscented soaps? What should I use if I have, sensitive skin? Something like that. If your FAQs and your product documentation has this information, the AI will know your product line, respond with the right products, maybe even suggest complementary items. So it's like having a knowledgeable shop assistant available 24/7.
I think that's a really good use case because honestly, that will cut out immediately, probably 75% of the inquiries that you get where it's just very easy, simple stuff that you personally don't need to answer. And if you've ever done customer support or anything like that, that can be, 95% of your time just answering questions.
Yeah, and you're going to lose that customer otherwise. You have to really match that intent. So you need to be responding quickly if you're going to keep them on your site and keep them engaged. You don't want them to send a support ticket and then you respond 24 hours later. They're gone. They're doing something else, so they bought it somewhere else.
100%. I mean, that is the problem with smaller businesses or startups, is that you do it because you love it or because you want more of a work-life balance, and then it just ends up taking over.
I remember when you and I were answering support tickets.
Oh, God, that was awful.
That was brutal. And that's when you learn how mean people can be online.
Yes.
The meanest things. Even then you would talk to someone in person, lovely human, wonderful, not mean at all. But there's sometimes the way people write is just mean.
It's so true. Anyway, what about some other use cases that aren't just customer support? Because that is just one piece of the puzzle. So what about something like data analysis? Because I think often startups or smaller businesses are just drowning in information and in data, but you don't have a data analyst on staff. That's a pretty niche role, but also that data is incredibly important to help you grow the business. So what does it look like for something like data analysis?
Yeah, this is where small models shine. So, if you were to have like 200 customer reviews, and that's way too many to read line by line, especially if you're getting this volume every month.
Yeah.
If you feed them to a small model, in seconds, it can highlight trends. It can look at how many people talk about shipping or how many people complain about packaging. It can really help you identify product improvements or recommendations. You know where to double down, where to improve in minutes instead of hours. A quick little check on this, LLM versus SLM. So the SLM, if you have a clear analysis that you want to do, the SLM is going to be great and it's going to process that very quickly. If you're trying to do more like open analysis because you don't know what to ask, maybe you switch to an LLM because you want that deeper reasoning. But for most analysis where you're really trying to identify trends, an SLM is great.
And honestly, that's gold for a smaller business owner, because that's exactly the sort of thing that you need to be able to deep dive into that you might not have the expertise to get into. But I also think it's important to talk about the elephant in the room. We alluded to this earlier. Privacy and security, because as always, if I'm feeding my customer data or, sensitive business information into these systems, is that something that I should be concerned about? Should I, what do I need to be aware of in that sort of situation?
Yeah. It's one of the biggest perks of small models. Many can run entirely on your own laptop or on like a small little server that doesn't cost too much. And then your data never leaves the building. So compare that to ChatGPT, where everything goes to OpenAI servers. And we've waved the be careful flag on that before. I think we've talked about it quite a bit. Yeah. But with a local SLM, you keep control, you reduce the risk, and you're staying compliant without extra hoops. That compliance piece might be really relevant to some businesses if you're trying to stay SOC 2 or ISO 27001 compliant. These SLMs might allow you to do that a lot easier because you don't have to talk about a separate, sub-processor.
And I know that's something like when I've done workshops around kind of the basics of AI, that was one of the immediate questions is like, how much should I be putting of my sensitive company information into a ChatGPT? So as an SLM is kind of the perfect antidote to that, especially for businesses or for anyone handling really sensitive information, whether healthcare or legal or financial services. Like this could absolutely be a game changer for those sorts of businesses.
Yeah, I'm not going to name any names, but I did recently hear about a very large company. They released their own company-wide AI product, but they told their employees not to put any sensitive business information in it. And so very quickly, you come to realize that, they're just using ChatGPT with an API. Not a great use case, not very helpful to call that your company-wide AI. This is one of those instances where now this company could probably afford to have an open source LLM, but might be a great use case for an SLM, for very company-specific tasks or for specific domains and functions. Another great example of this, like definitely in the space of healthcare. Yeah. So you really have to worry about patient information, HIPAA compliance. So a healthcare clinic could use a small local model to help with appointment scheduling, basic patient inquiries, or note-taking when you're having conversations with the patient. None of that patient data would get sent to a third party. It would all stay secure and private. So again, you can continue to be HIPAA compliant. It's going to make your privacy compliance a lot easier.
And in an instance like that, what about costs? Because I know we touched on this earlier, but let's get into a little bit of the details of how, what that looks like in terms of cost.
Yeah, the numbers can be really compelling there. Let's say you are a little bit more technical and you download one of these open weight models and run it locally on a server. It's going to be very cheap. That's just going to be the cost of that server running and processing questions. But even many of these no-code tools start for free or under like $20 a month. Compare that to enterprise AI solutions. They're going to cost thousands, tens of thousands, and the implementations of those, can get up into the millions. So if you go the local route, you might just pay a one-time setup cost and then, run it on your hardware or, in the cloud very cheaply.
So we're basically talking about a language model that is accessible to, your local restaurant, not just a Fortune 500 company, which is great. That's exactly the sort of thing that we support and we want, why we think that these are really helpful for a startup or for a smaller business.
These small models totally level the playing field. So a 10-person company can now offer 24/7 customer support, like we talked about, which could rival what a 10,000 person company offers with outsourced people to handle all of this. You can produce content at scale, again, that's personalized to the way you talk. You can analyze data thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of row very intelligently and automate routine tasks. So it can be a real game changer, and kind of on like a fun little bit, you can be like, hey, I have my own AI that's completely personalized to myself. Sounds pretty cool.
It's essentially like having a team of, really smart assistants or interns, as we always talk about our infinite intern analogy, without the salary and the benefit costs, which obviously could be prohibitively expensive for. I mean, look, we're hearing stories about data scientists who, understand AI and machine learning getting 6-7 figure salaries. So, that's
or
not.
If you work at OpenAI, billions of dollars.
Or billions. Yeah, exactly. So, that is not to everyone. But I think it's still worth making sure that we're being realistic here. Like, we always like to talk about the pros of AI, but also the cons. So what should people watch out for?
I think we talk about this a lot. It's definitely true here, as it is with everything else. Accuracy matters. So always test thoroughly before going live, especially on some of those edge cases. That's where productionized AI models can sometimes fall down. So review the work yourself, or have a human review the AI work, especially early on. Set clear boundaries. If the AI doesn't know something, it should say so rather than making things up. Since there's a lot less training data, a lot less ability to reason, AI hallucinations can be more prevalent here. And remember, the AI is a tool. It's not a magic solution. So you still need the strategy, the oversight, the human judgment, all those things that Sean was talking about. You still need all of that.
And I really imagine it's about, as we always say, you start small and then you scale it over time. It's not something that you jump into, with both feet immediately.
Yeah, absolutely. Pick a specific use case, find that one automation or workflow you want to, take away from having to do manually, get that working well, learn from it, and then expand to other areas. A small language model isn't going to AI-ify your entire business on day one. It's really built for those specific tasks. But as we're finding with AI tools and kind of as we think about agents and whatnot, it's those specific tasks that actually can really help you unlock, your productivity and your opportunities.
This might be where we're all headed, where we all have a private AI that sits on our system and eventually gets smarter as we give it more information and more data. With this instance, you only need an internet connection initially to download the model. And then after that, turn off your Wi-Fi and it's still going to work, right? But your prompts and the model's answers are all local. So it's not just great for privacy, it's also really good for reliability. You're not subject to API outages or rate limits. If ChatGPT goes down, which has happened before, you're not going to be affected. So and then, by the way, LM Studio is free for both personal and work use. So you can use it in your business without any licensing fees. I think that's kind of crazy good.
That's amazing, because I've been hitting Claude's limits pretty frequently for their pro user at the minute. And, I keep considering bumping it up to max, but then that really starts to build up over time. So this is actually going to be something that people are going to increasingly start to come across as all of the LLMs start to charge a little bit more. So this is great to know. But let's now go back to why someone would actually use something like this. So what are the main benefits of running a smaller model locally, especially for a business owner or an entrepreneur or a founder?
Yeah, there's several big benefits. As we said, for the privacy and security component, everything is on your device. Your data stays completely private. And this is critical if you're dealing with sensitive business data, whether that's financial records, client info, legal documents, because nothing is sent to an external server. So you have full control. The next big one is cost savings. Once the model is on your machine, you're not paying per query or, having to worry about number of tokens or anything like that. No API calls means no API bills. And, recently I was playing around with Cursor, developing an app, and all of a sudden I got hit with a $5 charge because Cursor's changed their, pricing scheme where now I'm getting charged for token use. So, but with this one, you can ask 1,000 questions without incurring any extra cost. Doing that would have cost a fortune if you did that with OpenAI GPT-5 calls. But, essentially, you leverage hardware you already own instead of renting AI time in the cloud. Now, there's obviously, you can't run as much as you want because you're limited by how much, hardware and space you have, but, you know, there's no limitation on the AI side. Similarly, another big benefit is customization. So you can tailor behavior with system prompt presets. This is where you're actually like changing the configuration that gets sent to the model. You can attach your own documents. That's the RAG process we talk about. Now, we mentioned this also. If you want to change the model's weights, talking about that open weight, you'll have to fine tune it with external tools and then run the tuned model in LM Studio, which is something you can do, but maybe a little bit beyond most people's use case. The other benefit, we've talked about offline availability. You don't need an internet connection after setup. So you could actually be doing this on a plane, which is one thing that I don't know if you've ever tried to do work on a plane, but you can't connect to OpenAI, right?
Well, I experienced this the other week when I was flying. I was flying Virgin Atlantic, and usually in the past, they've had pretty good Wi-Fi. And on this most recent trip, they've started charging for it, and I didn't need it so badly that I was going to pay for it. And it was good because it meant that I had the whole flight, not have to do any work, but it would have been nice to have, gotten the chance to get some stuff done. So,
or, the internet can just be spotty even when you pay for it.
Yeah.
But with these local models,
plain
you don't have
Wi-Fi
to worry
is
about
terrible.
that. Oh yeah, we all have
It's
experienced that. It's
Yeah.
frustrating, whatnot. But you don't have to worry about that. So this is sitting on your local computer. You can be doing a lot of work on that plane with a local model. And then I think the last bit that's really important is the integration and control. With tools like LM Studio, you can even connect the model to your own applications and not have to worry about privacy concerns. So for example, LM Studio can serve the model through like an OpenAI compatible API on your local host machine. That might sound like gibberish to some people, but this nerdy detail means if you have some software or scripts, you can plug in your local AI into them as if it were a cloud AI. So that's great for developers building custom solutions. But even for non-developers, they can benefit from the fact that the AI is under your control and can be extended in various ways. The takeaway here is because of that kind of control and customization, I think you have a lot of runway of places to go with an SLM.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a lot of flexibility, which is probably the
Great way
real
to put it.
benefit. But I'm also wondering, how do I actually use this in my day-to-day business tasks? So let's get into some real-world use cases. So, for example, let's say I want to do some analysis on my business. What could an SLM and LM Studio help me do?
Great question. And I think one of the most powerful uses is turning your little local AI into a kind of data analyst or research assistant. So imagine if you have a big spreadsheet of sales data or a PDF report with all your quarterly metrics. Or, separately, if you're getting PDF reports of other people's, of your competitors' information. So imagine you have, normally you'd have to comb through that yourself or upload it to some cloud service to analyze, or what most people are probably doing is just attaching it into ChatGPT. But again, we talk about the privacy concerns. But with LM Studio, you can attach documents to a chat and ask the model questions about them all offline. So, again, we call this our RAG system, but basically it means the model can reference your provided documents to give informed answers. So for example, you load up a sales report and ask, hey, what were my top 3 selling SKUs last quarter and why do you think they performed well? So the model would read your report locally and then generate an answer based on only that data.
So it's a little bit like your computer has a little library sitting there, and it will go away and it will, do the research and gives the answer using that information. So it's like a little built-in library. That's probably the easiest way to think of RAG.
That's a great analogy. That's exactly right. The model itself, again, if you haven't given it anything before, it's not going to know anything about your specific business. It can't go out into the internet and search like ChatGPT can nowadays because it has, an agent in the background that does that. But once you provide the context, your data, your documents, it can analyze and discuss it. And, this approach covers one of the limitations of smaller models. They don't come pre-trained on your proprietary info. But with a tool like LM Studio, you can supply that information when you need it. And because it's all local, even sensitive data like financials or confidential plans and strategies can be used without worry. So in fact, this method has been used in finance. I've seen a lot of references about integrating a local model via LM Studio. You can do that with different libraries that brings in, stock data so that, confidential financial info never has to leave the local machine.
Which is so valuable if you are working in a field where that sort of information is really important, like, a medical practice or whatever. You really don't want medical information being shared. Not only do you not want it being shared, that's a HIPAA violation. So it's a pretty
Yeah.
serious offense if it is shared.
That's a great, use case. What about, an independent hospital pulling up an SLM, giving it access to patient data, but it all sits on their computers, never goes outside, and gives, nurses and doctors a way to search all of that patient data. Could be a great use case.
That's great. So bringing it back to a business use case. So you could say something like, here are my sales numbers, here are my expenses, give me a summary or any anomalies that you see, and it would generate that. In fact, I might do this with my own expenses because I've been going through my expenses over the last couple of days while I've been, incapacitated with this dental surgery. And I would love to have it go through and identify any anomalies in my expenses.
I love that. Let's, next episode, deep dive into your expenses, look exactly what you're spending your money on.
Wow, this sounds like so much fun.
Sounds a little personal.
Yeah,
but,
exactly.
Look, I think, the model, what can it do? The model could, summarize trends, highlight anomalies where you're spending too much money. It can do simple calculations, categorizations. Categorizations, I think, are a great, use case.
That would actually make life so...
Yeah, feed it all of your credit card data and say, hey, categorize how am I spending and build a budget for me.
Yeah.
I mean, that's,
or even,
I've been doing that.
Like last year, I was on the road for 6 weeks for work stuff. I just had back-to-back conferences. And so I racked up a lot. We're talking hundreds of travel expenses for work. And actually, one of the most time-consuming parts of it was categorizing everything.
It's a great use case. I think things like classification or, if we're talking about like text, sentiment analysis, summarization, that's a lot of what I've used it for. Take these emails, take these meeting notes, look at sentiment analysis, summarize, key points and action items. So, if you have customer feedback emails, you could ask the model to read them and tell you the main pain points customers are mentioning most. It's great for product research. Or you could categorize each feedback as positive, neutral, or negative sentiment automatically and, gauge customer satisfaction. These are all things you could do with large language models, but they're going to eat up a lot of tokens. Small language model running locally, basically processing in the background can be really, really powerful.
So we always talk about our infinite intern, and this is the perfect example. In this particular instance, the intern lives on your laptop, but also it can speed read, it can summarize, it works 24/7, it understands language, nuances, all that stuff. It kind of has it's got like a baseline knowledge to it. And then what you're doing is you're feeding it the more specialized knowledge about your business or your particular situation.
Yep. And unlike a cloud service, this AI intern doesn't risk leaking your internal data. So, I want to go back to kind of one of my examples of doing competitive analysis. Suppose you have a folder of business documents. This is market research PDFs. It could be everything you've captured about, other businesses. You could have your own company's internal knowledge base as well as kind of like a contrast. You could load those up and ask questions like, what were the key market trends identified in last year's research? How does my strategy compare to trends in the industry? The SLM is going to be able to pick out the details from those files and answer specifically based on the data you give it. So this, addresses one common shortfall of AI models, is that knowledge cutoff or lack of specific company knowledge. It's the context that I harp on constantly. If a small model doesn't know something by itself, you can give it the knowledge on the fly and overcome that gap, but within that very specific, niche use case.
And I think the context thing is huge because that was definitely one concern that I had, is that these smaller models might not know, about my specific industry. So in my day-to-day work, I do a lot of stuff around streaming and the TV industry and broadcast and all that, which is niche knowledge. So that was one thing I was a little worried about, but knowing that I can feed it to the
Mhm.
SLM and give it that additional knowledge, and the additional context is very useful to know.
Exactly. You become the curator of its knowledge. So if you want it to be up to date on something, you provide the document or the data. I mean, that gives you a lot of control. So, this really goes back to our prompt engineering when we talk about context. You are providing all of the context for it to, make the answer. So, then it can apply its language understanding and reasoning to that specific information. So in technical terms, you're doing RAG, which kind of levels the playing field for small models by supplementing their knowledge, but also giving it really distinct, specific context so that it doesn't go out into the world and try to reason on a bunch of other training data. These small language models are really good at understanding instructions and context. You just need to give them the right context to work with, which, again, if you haven't watched our prompt engineering episode, because that'll really help you with small language models.
Got it. Now, how about doing things in business beyond just analysis? Because we've talked a lot about analysis, but what about something like generating content? Because, I've talked about it before. I have to
Mhm.
do a newsletter. I hate writing this newsletter. Everyone knows that I hate writing this newsletter. And I lean on AI quite heavily to help me generate the first
Mhm.
version of content. Obviously, I go in and I tweak it, but could a small local model help me write this content or create this content in my own voice? Because I think I've said before, we have to write this content in a very specific style.
Mhm. Yes, absolutely. And I think this is where it gets really fun. You can absolutely use a local model as a writing assistant. And in some ways, that might be the perfect use case as your little personal AI.
Yeah.
You can tailor it to mimic your voice or brand style with all of the documents. So feed it emails of things you've written. Feed it your writing samples. I think there's a couple ways that you can approach this. So again, prompt it with examples. So the simplest way is to give the model a few examples of your writing and then ask it to produce something similar. So you might feed it 2 or 3 of your past blog posts or social updates, and then say, now write a new paragraph about X, Y, and Z topic in a similar tone and style. The model's going to pick up on your phrasing and style cues from those examples and provide you with, a really good output. Another way is these presets. So LM Studio, for example, lets you create preset instructions or system prompts. This is kind of in the settings or a configuration. So you could make a preset like, you are an AI copywriter that writes in Jess's style, friendly, witty, concise, with occasional humor. So the configuration almost gives it that race context that we talk about with the role, action, context, and example. You can put that in the configuration so it always responds in that way, so that whenever you start a chat for copywriting, you apply that preset. And this way you guide its tone without having to do it over and over and over again. And then the last bit is this fine tuning. This really takes it beyond where you can go further, where you're changing the model to actually, on your own writing using open source tools. Again, the training will happen outside LM Studio. So this does require some technical setup. Once done, you can load the resulting model back into LM Studio and then run it locally, like we've been talking about. So RAG and presets are like feeding the model examples when you're actually trying to do the thing, while fine tuning
Okay.
is teaching the model permanently. So it always has that context to go from.
That sounds really technical, though. Is that the sort of thing that I would need to hire a developer to fine tune the model for my brand voice, or is that something
Not
I could do myself?
Yeah, not necessarily. And I know we have different levels. Everyone kind of comes at this a little differently. So if you're not comfortable with the technical side, presets and prompt-based techniques will get you a really long way. It just means that you have to do a little bit more on setup each time. But
Mm.
if you do fine tune, you can do it entirely on your own machine with, open source tools. So your personal data stays private as well. But yeah, you might need to know a little bit of code, be comfortable with the command line interface. That might be a little much for some of our audience.
But there are other options. It's not like you can only do this if you fine tune. There are things
Yeah.
for us less technical people to
Yeah.
do.
I don't think you need to fine tune with
Yeah.
this. I think using the presets and the configuration, in some ways that might give you more control as well, because every time you're thinking through your prompt structure, you're thinking through the context you're giving it, that might be better.
So practically speaking, I could have it write like a product description or a LinkedIn post, because I hate writing LinkedIn posts, and it would actually sound like me, which is exactly the sort of thing that I want AI to help me with.
Do a little tweaking or provide feedback just as you would with any, AI generated text. But generally, yes, you can generate a draft. And if a sentence doesn't sound like you can say, hey, can you rephrase this to be more casual? Because the model is running on a live chat context. So it can adjust with, that context window, just like we talk about, and always be iterating. You can go through a collaborative writing process with the model. So if your model is running locally, you can safely share examples of your past work to improve the results and don't have to worry about where your data may end up.
I'm actually really excited about this because I have something similar that I use now with Claude, using Claude's projects, but I think this is going to take that to the next level. So I'm already thinking ahead about how I can build this for my newsletter copy going forward. So I think I'm going to give this a try next week, and I'll report back and let you know how I get on, because I actually think that this could be much more effective than what I've been dealing with.
Yeah, I think as we're seeing a lot of these larger cloud hosted models like Claude and OpenAI start to rate limit you.
Yeah.
And if you're out there and you're really coming up against those boundaries, that it's constantly rate limiting you and saying, hey, you got to wait an hour because you've gone through as much as you can.
It's so annoying, and it never actually restarts at the time that it says. It's like the time zone that it gives is really kind of made up.
Exactly. And I think we're going to see more and more of that because a lot of
I agree.
these LLM providers, they're hitting rate limits and it's a cost issue. They wanted us to get hooked on the drug and use it as much as possible, but that was burning through cash. And so now they're trying to pull back now that we're stuck with them and we've gotten really comfortable with it. But that's starting to be really painful from a user experience perspective. I think these small language models can really be the way that we fix a lot of that for the user.
So this is the sort of thing that OpenAI is even doing with Chat GPT, right? Because they're doing like the simpler model for easier questions, and then the more advanced version for something like deep research. So it's what they're looking at themselves.
Exactly.
But I have to ask, what about quality? Because I think we talked a little bit about this last week, but I think it's worth reiterating. I know, these smaller models have improved a lot, but can they really compete with something like ChatGPT or Claude? Like, what's the trade-off when you go smaller and more local?
Yeah, that's a fair question. And the truth is, the very largest models, they still have an edge in raw knowledge and the subtlety of their responses. But I think the gap is narrowing quickly, especially OpenAI's small language model, which you can use in LM Studio, by the way. So for most day-to-day business tasks, things like writing an email, summarizing a report, analyzing a PDF or an Excel spreadsheet, like we talked about in our examples, open source models like OpenAI's GPT OSS, Meta's Llama, or one of Mistral's small language models, I think they're going to do the job extremely well. They've narrowed that gap considerably and are probably going to be very consistent to how we first started interacting with LLMs back a couple years ago. But then if you're working with your own data or documents and giving it that context, I think a smaller model running locally may actually be more accurate because you're giving it the specific context it needs rather than hoping a big model guesses correctly. And of course, and I think you coined the term perfectly, it gives you that flexibility. So you can choose a model size that balances the speed and the capability. A 7 billion parameter model is super lightweight and fast on a laptop, while a 30 billion or 70 billion model, if your hardware can handle it, will give you a lot more sophistication while still being on your local computer.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And I assume if I ever hit the limitations, like the model doesn't know something, I can either feed it the info as context, or, worst case, I can still go use Claude or Chat for that particular query. It's not like you can never use any of the LLMs ever again. But I think for the majority of daily tasks, it sounds like these smaller models are going to be more than enough.
I think we're going to start moving towards a hybrid approach. 90% of the time you're using the local model with your context to, write documents or analyze information. And then the other 10%, you're doing, deep research, before your morning coffee or something like that. Or if you're looking for really up-to-date information or looking for a cutting edge topic, that's where you can use the, OpenAI, that's because you're not going to have that context, or you're going to want, more kind of just open-ended responses. You're not looking for something super tailored or super specific to you. But honestly, once you get used to supplementing the model with your own documents or presets, I think you'll be surprised how rarely you need to go back to the cloud. So the more you tailor the model to your world, the better it gets for your purposes, which is, I think, how most people are using ChatGPT and Claude anyway.
Okay, so a big question now. Are there any other limitations that any of our listeners should be aware of? Like, are there any hardware requirements or maintenance? Because it feels like this is going to be really heavy on a laptop or a desktop, and it's going to be a lot of work. We all know that feeling when your computer feels like it's about to overheat and explode because it's been working so hard.
Yeah, good point. I don't think you need a supercomputer. A modern laptop with, again, this little techie, but 16 gigabytes of RAM can comfortably run a 7 billion parameter model. Apple machines handle them especially well. But I think the sweet spot for most people is in that 7 billion to 13 billion parameter range. Just remember, model downloads are going to be a few gigabytes. So plan for some disk space. And then long sessions are going to use more of your CPU or your GPU, like running a really big app or a video game. The good news is that still makes it very accessible. And most of us, a lot of us, play video games or have big apps on our laptops. So it's not like this is very different from anything else.
I was going to say, it can't be any worse than trying to run something from Adobe on a laptop.
Oh,
like,
it's going to be way less than that. Way less than that.
Trying to run Photoshop or Premiere Pro is one that I've used a lot for video editing. Premiere Pro is a beast.
It's going to way outperform those for sure.
Thank God for that. So it does actually sound like LM Studios handles a lot for you. It can download the models, it can give you the chat interface. So it's not like I have to, learn how to code. You don't need to know how to do any of the really fancy stuff, right?
Yeah, it's designed to be beginner friendly. Right. Actually, after you download it and open it up, it actually gives you two different paths, whether you're a beginner or whether you're a little more advanced. The beginner version, it's very simple. You open it up, you browse the model catalog, you download that and wait for the download to finish, and then you start chatting with it right away. It's super plug and play. As you get more advanced, you can attach the documents that we're talking about. But if you're just, want something really simple, want answers and copy really quick, you don't need to touch any of the technical stuff. It's pretty intuitive.
I swear this episode is not sponsored by LM Studio, although, if they want to sponsor us, we're not going to say no. Hey, LM Studio, call us.
But this almost feels like a tool review more than how to use small language models.
It does a bit, but you actually struggled to find many alternatives to LM Studio that allowed the same, that had the same capabilities. So that is the reason why we are focusing particularly on this tool. So it's a little bit of a tool review / business use case example. But I do genuinely feel like this could be a game changer for a lot of entrepreneurs and small businesses. I can already think of quite a few people that I want to chat to about this because I think it can really help them out. So let's just do a quick recap in kind of non-technical language, because this is a little bit more technical than I think we try to get. We try to keep it a little higher level, but we did feel like this was an important topic to discuss. So with a small local model or an SLM via LM Studio, we can ask detailed questions about my own business data without having to hire an analyst or without having to send data to an outside service. You could generate content and copy in your own voice. So that could be anything from emails to marketing materials. You can, fine tune it on your own style of writing. You could use it to brainstorm and get ideas for strategies, social media posts, product names, all of that good stuff. And then, as we keep reiterating, privacy and security, because everything is on your device. And honestly, the most important thing, it will save costs in the long run because you don't have the subscription or pay-per-use models. Did I miss anything there? I just threw an awful lot of information out there.
No, I think you covered it perfectly, actually. But I think one more point that I'll talk about is the community and some of the model availability. So there is also a thriving community releasing all sorts of open source models. There are dozens of varieties. A great number of these SLMs are open source and easily accessible on a site called Hugging Face and other hubs. So LM Studio taps into that, meaning you have a model marketplace at your fingertips. So if one model doesn't give good answers for your use case or you're not liking the output, try another one with a couple clicks. And you can kind of in that way, experiment with your specific use cases. And new models are coming out all the time. So the progress in the last year or two on these has been incredible. And one limitation, though, that I was just kind of thinking about as we were talking about it, you can't really share a lot of this. It really is going to be your personal AI assistant.
That's a good thing to flag. That's a good thing to be aware of.
How often do we really share a lot of our prompts and stuff that we do? I think it's a more limited use case. So that is a limitation to be wary of.
Okay, interesting. But before we wrap up on this particular section, Kyle, do you have any final tips?
I would join communities or forums. There's a Discord for LM Studio. If you need help or ideas, people love sharing prompt tips and suggestions. I think there's a whole movement of folks who are like trying to get away from open AI and want to use their, local AI.
All right. So that is us for this week. Thank you for listening to Early Adopter.
Quick reminder, this is one of our favorite episodes. So if you're tuning in right now, it's because we're taking a holiday break. And don't worry, we'll be back soon with new stuff in the new year.
Before we go, if you want to join us for our first webinar on the 4th of February, you can find the link in the show notes or head over to maven.com to sign up.
It's going to be a real live conversation with us and Sean. You'll remember him from our 3-part series around AI policy. So this is no script, no corporate speak, no buzzwords or jargon from us. You know how we like to hit that jargon buzzer. It's just us, you, and some good questions about AI and how to actually use it in your business.
And as always, you can find us on Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn, and YouTube. We are at early_adopter. Remember, no E in adopter. Send us your AI stories, your questions, your wins, your failures, your own AI gone wrong. As always, we always want to hear from our listeners.
And just remember, there's no E in the adopter.
Thanks for listening, and we will see you in the new year.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy holidays, everyone.
Bye.